Blood of Dragons, Volume 9, Truth in the Shadows, Chapter 1, Dim Hollow Crypt. The battle, if it could be called as such, was over almost before any of those within the enormous cavern realized it had begun. Attacking from the shadows, the trio had charged into the midst of the larger group and had begun killing even before weapons could be raised against them. Swords flashed, and an axe hacked down hard into meat and bone, taking lives and leaving the ancient stones covered with gore, viscera, and the bodies of the fallen. Ancient stones and carved pillars were coated in blood, but it wasn't just gore that covered the crypt's interior, wafting in the breeze. And lifted up by the very flames that had picked the bones clean, the ash and dust of the 4 slain vampires clung to the trio's clothing, adhering and mixing with the blood of the mortals to form a red-black paste. You know what's the worst part about killing vampires? Kneeling over one of the unburnt corpses, Kaius looked over to Sophia while using the dead thrall's hair to wipe his sword clean of blood, watching as she complained and attempted to brush away the dust of the vampire she had slain. There's a worst part? Of course. The worst part is that no matter what I do, I can never get the dust out of my armor. Stopping mid-stride, Sophia reached down, tugging on her belt and pants with one hand while she returned her blade to its scabbard with the other. All my underwear. Limestone powder mixed with water for cloth. Despite wearing several dozen kilograms of armor and equipment, Kaius moved as softly as a cloud as he rose to his feet. And for armor, nothing beats a barrel filled with sand. I know, but no matter how well we wash and clean, I always feel so ick. I think you just need to buy me some new clothes. Choosing to ignore Sophia's comment and the way she framed it, Kaius turned and looked over to Lydia, who was in the process of removing her spectacle helm and pulling her padded coif down. Lydia, are you okay? Shaking her hair free as she removed her helmet. The housecarl nodded, a short, sharp motion that made some of her carefully maintained braids shake loose. Sometime during the fight, a dagger's strike had scored a long, silvery scratch from the right temple across the helmet's side. Only through a combination of superb reflexes and luck had she managed to turn her head at the last second, instead of taking the dagger into an eye. I'm fine, my Thane. Nothing a few days polishing won't fix. Did you have to kill them like that, though? Lydia looked between Sophia and the last 2 thralls she had slain. Both of the corrupted individuals were emaciated and thin, dressed in rags and cobbled together remains of clothes clinging to their gaunt frames. What they lacked in equipment, however, was almost made up for in their insane devotion to their vampiric masters, which resulted them in throwing themselves at the housecarl with nothing more than a pair of daggers and a rock. The first thrall, a woman with a throat covered in scar tissue from repeated feedings, had died after Lydia had broken her leg with a powerful kick and buried her axe Hakunstran between her eyes. As for the other, a thin and anemic man responsible for the scratch on her helmet, he had been punched in the mouth and then slammed face first into the pedestal in the center of the room. I don't see the problem. Heavy, metallic footsteps echoed after Lydia finished donning her helmet, walking over and planting a boot on the chest of the dead woman before wrenching her axe free of skull and brain. The sheer force of her blow, combined with the incredible craftsmanship of her family's heirloom axe, had practically split the woman's head in half, all the way down to the bottom jaw. With an exasperated expression on her face, Sophia gestured between the housecarl shaking blood and the contents of the thrall's skull from her axe, to the way that the man was still kneeling on the pedestal, his head transfixed with a 30-centimeter long spike. That wasn't me. The spike came out when the top was pushed down. There was a muffled clinking of chainmail as Lydia shrugged. It must have been some kind of trap. Good thing we didn't use our hands then. Completely undisturbed at the sight of the impalement, Kaius was moving around the room, looking at the large, swirling series of grooves on the floor and the remains of their foes scattered about. What's our tally so far? 17 thralls, 8 vampires. Lydia spoke without hesitation, not even glancing around at the latest bodies scattered around the room, and Kaius nodded, satisfied with her count. Quite a few of the bastards in here. Indeed, this isn't usual vampire behaviour. Kaius was moving around as he replied to Sophia, looking and glancing over the faint glows from the grooves and the dim pedestal mounted braziers burning with purplish flames, situated between the central pedestal and the outer ring of pillars. The reports of the Dawn Guard got about this place were as accurate as to their number, but not what they were doing. This isn't a coven, and it's too far away from the villages to be an hunting outpost. Hiding from the authorities, perhaps? Not in these numbers. This lot would be a serious threat to any of the nearest towns. Sophia, what do you think? Whatever they are doing, this room is a big part of it. It had taken them a full 2 weeks to travel to this backwater, long disused crypt built thousands of years before in search of the vampires that were now nothing more than bones and ash on the stone floor. Sophia had picked up one of the lanterns the thralls were using to illuminate the interior and was studying the curved pillars and their arches, arranged in a circle around the braziers and central pedestal. This whole room doesn't look anything like what Bleak Falls Barrow did. That's what I was thinking too. A pickaxe, one of the several impromptu weapons wielded by the thralls, rattled on the floor as Kaius nudged it with a boot. They have been here digging for quite some time now, and it took a lot of effort on their part to dig into here. Obviously, it's something important. Like loot? The gleam in Sophia's eye almost matched that of her appetite for alcohol and sex. Not sure. There's magicka here, subtle but present. Maybe an artifact or something. So, in other words, loot? Kaius ignored her this time, seeing the way that Lydia was moving around the central pedestal and the still impaled corpse. My Thane, the blood is seeping into the floor. Casting and then flinging a fresh mage light to replace one of those he had used to aid them in their attack, Kaius strode over to Lydia. One of the mage lights stuck to the bottom of a pillar and revealed the remains of what had been a corrupted human, reduced to a smear. Little more than a broken, ruptured mess of broken limbs and jellified organs, the thrall had been one of the first to die as Kaius used his thum to devastating effect. He called the shout unrelenting force, but how the words Fusro Da inflicted such devastating effects when Kaius shouted them, Sophia had no clue. Besides their volume, they were less migraine-inducing than normal magicka, so she almost preferred them. It must be some sort of ritual chamber, scarification or something. The blood from the man and the woman Lydia killed was sluggishly pouring and collecting around the base of the central pedestal, and then flowing into a hexagonal series of grates in the cold stone floor. Perhaps even... Whatever words Kaius had was lost, as there was a grinding clunk that they all felt more than heard as it ran through the floor, before a tremble ran through the soles of their feet. In hissing spurts of dust, the circular grooves erupted and began sliding apart, the concentric designs revealing themselves to be a series of stairs that slid and thudded into place, even as the trio scrambled up and out of the way. The bodies of those they had slain trembled and jerked as though they were alive once more, their blood splattering and bubbling as each of the newly formed steps locked into position one after the other. Bones and ashes rattled and flowed like the blood of the thralls, as the remains of the vampires were shaken further apart, tumbling down several of the steps in turn until the rumbling vibrations and echoes died away. Well, that was different. 30 meters in diameter, the circular chamber had been transformed, the floor dropping away into a deep set of stairs that partially resembled an amphitheatre of sorts. Only a 2-meter tall, hexagonal pillar, capped by the central pedestal with its macabre, fleshy, impaled decoration, remained. I guess we have discovered what the vampires were trying to accomplish with moving the braziers around. Some kind of locking mechanism. Dwemer? Lydia asked curiously, in her usual deadpan tone. No, this is too crude, and there's none of their metal here. This feels Nordic somehow. Stepping down the stairs, with Sophia and Lydia close behind, Kaius approached the central hexagonal pillar, looking over its perfectly smoothed exterior and running his fingers over the cold black granite. I don't have the slightest idea what this is. Our great and masterful hero has discovered something he doesn't know. Maybe I should run off and have it announced in the Black Horse Courier? Ha ha, very funny, Sophia. My Thane, there is a seam here. It's also partially enchanted, Kaius added, looking over to where Lydia was running her fingers over the tiny seam in one of the pillar's corners. It might be hollow. Let's see if we can open it up and see what's inside. Without hesitation, Lydia's axe returned to her hand, and she pressed it into the seam, attempting to gain some form of purchase to leverage it open. Grunting and heaving back on her weapon, there wasn't even the slightest movement from any part of the wide pillar. She pulled back on it again to the same lack of effect. It feels like it's caught on something. Guys? What is it, Sophia? Without even looking at her, Kaius had pressed the point of his sky-forged steel broadsword slightly below Lydia's axe in an attempt to assist. There was a sudden, inaudible click, and the resistance on their axe and sword vanished as the heavy stone shifted in its position. It was unhinging, yawning open slowly, and lowering itself down onto the tiered floor like a castle drawbridge, leaving Kaius and Lydia to turn and stare at Sophia. What did you do? I pushed the button, Sophia shrugged, from a position on the other side of the pillar. Chapter 2. Revelation. Grinding and groaning, the side of the pillar fell away, aided in the way that its interior consisted of a series of ancient stone gears and mechanisms that allowed it to hinge open. It was solid and unyielding, several centimeters thick, and the shudder that ran through their boots could be felt in the pits of their stomach when it finally came to rest. I don't know what we were all expecting. Sophia had to step around from the opposite side to peer into the now opened pillar. But this doesn't feel to be it. It's a sarcophagus. An occupied sarcophagus. Face framed in the blue-white glow of Kaius's mage lights, Lydia's armoured form lurked like a statue of metal as the three of them looked into what the pillar contained. Well, it is a crypt after all. What were you expecting? A hall full of gold and jewels, or living people inside of coffins? The stare that Lydia gave Sophia was one of her signature ones that appeared capable of leaving bruises, her eyes glaring out from behind her helmet and aventail. Contained within the pillar, held in place by the interior's design, was a body, one that time had not been merciful towards. Its flesh was dried, brittle and shrunken, all moisture long since vanished, leaving the remains as a skeletal husk wrapped around ancient bones. Its teeth were rotten or missing, hair in ragged clumps, and whatever clothing it had once been wearing had long since rotted away into dust and powder. The body was so thoroughly dried out that it was practically fossilized into matching the granite that surrounded it. We came all this way just to find a dead woman? Not necessarily. Mage light in hand, Kaius was leaning in and looking at the way that the body's head was tilted back, locked into place by the way that the sarcophagus's interior was carved into a roughly humanoid shape to keep the body upright. I doubt the vampires were interested in a corpse as such, but to be buried like this meant that whoever this was, they were important. Like a queen or something? Possibly. There's nothing left to show any details of who or what they were, but you can certainly don't bury paupers and peasants like this. Peasants and paupers like us, you mean? The stillness of the crypt was playing on their nerves, but not as much as the drip, 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 and the sound of blood splattering. Mounted on top of the revealed hexagonal pillar, the spiked pedestal and still impaled corpse was hanging above their heads, some of the blood staining the pillar's sides as it dribbled and congealed. Most of it, however, was draining through the grates at the pedestal's base into the sarcophagus's interior, flowing along the carved stonework and dripping directly onto the desiccated body's face and open mouth. Do you suppose the Draugr are angry because we disturbed their sleep? I know I would be pretty angry. Not that she's a draugr or anything, though. You keep saying she or her. Lydia gave the body a quick head-to-toe glance at Sophia's words. How do you know how do you know it's a she? Well, she's got a woman's hips. I mean, isn't that pretty obvious? But what do you mean she's not a draugr then? No embalming, no removal of organs or preparation. The dragon cult would remove your guts, your brain, and everything else from inside and store it away in burial jars. They would also soak you in resin. She hasn't had any of this, and she hasn't been mummified. But she's all desecrate. The aversion was palatable on Lydia's face as she tried to find the correct word. All dried up. That's what happens when you get locked away in a stone box instead of being buried in the ground, Kaius muttered. She must have been important to be put away like this. It's certainly not traditional Nordic burial practices from the last 3 eras, but it's also not Nedic, dragon cult, or even snow elves. There are no inscriptions, no runes or carvings on the outside. I don't know of any of the local cultures that had the habit of burying people alive like this. Slowly, and with astonishment, both Lydia and Kaius turned and looked at Sophia as she stood there glancing between them. What? That's probably one of the most intelligent things I've ever heard come out of your mouth. Glancing between her and the corpse, Kaius gestured to the sarcophagus. How do you know all this? Not just my gorgeous appearance and my incredible fighting prowess. Sophia stuck her tongue out at the two of them. I read books, and if you spend as much of your time jumping into Skyrim's tombs and barrows as I have, you might learn as much as I have. So you have read more than just the lusty Argonian maid. A girl will always have favourites, she replied, looking at Kaius for a moment and trying not to focus on how the corpse was positioned, as though its head was tilted back in a silent scream. She was especially not trying to focus on the amount of blood that had covered its face, lips, and mouth. I hope I don't die and end up looking like the draugr. That would be my worst nightmare. And there's the Sophia we know. There was no mistaking the tiny chuckle from Kaius as he held the mage light in the palm of his hand, looking over the interior of the sarcophagus. There's various runes and inscriptions on the inside. Most look like enchantments, but I can't read or understand any of them. They're nothing like I've ever seen before. It's pretty hard to read the ones on the inside of the lid as well, with all the scratches. Glancing down to their feet, Kaius looked over the similar markings that had been engraved into the inside of the sarcophagus's lid. Sophia was right in the way that they were difficult to read. Despite being carved from granite, there were dozens of parallel scratches lightly marking and defacing the carefully made runes and inscriptions. Fingernails. Talus's balls. She was locked in here while she was still alive. All three turned and looked at the desiccated, skeletal figure, its head and face increasingly covered in the blood of slain thralls, and Sophia shivered at the thought of being trapped in such a way. None of this makes any sort of sense. I mean, the rest of the crypt we came through to get to this far is definitely ancient Nordic, early First Era at the latest. But this whole cavern seems newer somehow. It's still very, very old. How old do you think? No way to be sure. Sophia shrugged, not even thinking about how Kaius had immediately deferred to her knowledge without any hesitation. The dragon cult was destroyed at least 4,000 years ago, and the upper layers here are definitely older than that. But everything else here is wrong. The architecture, the design, the layout. They were big on blood sacrifices, but nothing this complex. Cutting throats into a bowl, decapitation, cutting out hearts, or staking a sacrificial victim to the ground for a dragon to eat them. Those were their usual methods. Maybe this was a punishment or something. Stepping forward to get a closer look at the corpse and the sarcophagus's interior with a mage light in hand, Kaius frowned, chewing the inside of his cheek and thought, there looks like there might be a compartment or something behind her. Sophia, give me a hand here. Of course you want me to help you fill up a woman. Why don't you ever offer to feel me up? In the months they had been travelling together, Sophia's joking and teasing was a reoccurring theme, and she never failed to take advantage of making Kaius feel awkward with her innuendo. It was mostly in jest, but always highly amusing for her, and at the moment it was making their efforts to move the blood-splattered, rigid, and ancient corpse to one side a lot easier, at least until she saw the way that its sunken eyelids had opened. At first she tried to put it down to a trick of the flickering blue-white mage light as it began to dim. Staring directly into the empty black hollows where the dead woman's eyes had once been, Sophia still felt as though the dead woman was somehow looking back at her. Both sockets were empty, the eyes long since rotting into dust, but there was movement in the shadows of the skull. Movement that Sophia tried to convince herself was nothing more than her and Kaius jolting the body, at least until the jaw began moving, and a skeletal, dried-out hand came to rest on her arm. After a second's worth of shock and a moment of building horror and realization as the understanding sunk in, she staggered away with a rolling, breathless series of curses and profanity that struck with almost as much thought force as Caius's thum. Kaius, too, was left backing away in shock and surprise, his hand falling to the hilt of his broadsword as the long, dried-out body began twitching and spasming. Why can't anything in this damned province stay dead? With her axe back in her hand, Lydia had begun moving between them and the twitching corpse, before Caius's voice echoed through the cavern. "Lydia, wait." "I'm sorry, my Thane, but why?" We've triggered some sort of enchantment. His own shock and surprise was wearing off, just as quickly as the sensation of magicka was building strong enough for all three of them to feel. "Don't get too close." The throbbing pulses of magicka continued to build, and even Lydia, unaccustomed and inexperienced with the arcane, could feel the overwhelming potency of the powers that had been unleashed. A red and purple glow was building, the runes and inscriptions of the engraved interior glowing and shimmering, occasionally sparking with elemental discharges that left the air cold and tingling. Step by step, feeling the pressure on their souls, they backed away up the stairs while attempting to judge what would be a safe distance. At first, it was as though the body was shaking and trembling, as though it was being repeatedly struck with lightning. But as the magicka in the air grew, and the first of the changes began to appear, it was slow, some flesh softening here, additional strands of hair growing from the wizened scalp there, and all three of them realized that there was none of the typical blue glows of its eyes that were the usual signifier of necromantic powers. Sophia was left groaning and pressing a palm into her temple at the sheer, throbbing might of the enchantments activating one by one. It was tremendously powerful, spiking through her brain in waves of pain as the magicka flowed from the stone enchantments and into the trembling body as it was restored to life. Hands clenched into fists so tightly that a living person would have drawn blood with their fingernails, arms and legs shaking to the point where the sounds of bone crunching echoed through the crypt. But the body was changing, piece by piece. It began where the blood had stained the brittle grey flesh, skin and muscle and ligaments softening and stretching, the pinkness of vitality spreading from mouth, cheeks, lips and face, down the neck and throat as it went. Eyes reappeared in the sunken empty sockets, pale blue and staring out in agony, tongue reforming in a mouth where the decayed and blackened pegs regrew anew into fresh white teeth. The entire process looked like absolute agony to the horrified trio witnessing the magical restoration, but it soon sounded as painful as it looked, as the changes spread over the throat and into the chest. Blackened, shriveled organs began to move, and the withered heart within the brittle ribcage and wafer-thin skin began to pulse in time with the magicka. Lungs expanded and reformed, their expansion soon hidden under the rolling wave of fresh muscle and skin, and the dead woman began screaming without pause. Muscles grew and expanded, bones solidified, and skin softened, losing its papyrus-like texture that it only had moments before. Even the hair, once being little more than a clump of faded strands jutting from a skin-taut skull, began to thicken and multiply, fresh growth erupting from the scalp, and growing sleek and dark like polished ebony. Gone was the withered, dried-out skeletal remains, and in its place was a young naked woman with sleek raven-black hair who collapsed, face first, out of the open sarcophagus. Chapter 3. Resurrection. For several long seconds, no one moved. Sophia was trying to control her breathing and manage the throbbing headache, digging like iron-tipped worms into her skull like Kaius had taught her, but they were all staring, stunned at the sight of the restored woman whimpering, face down on the opened sarcophagus lid. "I've never heard of a Draugr being able to do that," Lydia exclaimed, her axe still in hand and ready, especially as Kaius cautiously stepped forward to the woman. "I think we've established that she's not a Draugr." "Then what is she?" There was almost no sign that the woman was aware of her surroundings, lolling and twitching about as Kaius kneeled next to her body, brushing the luxurious black hair out of her face and studying her intently. If it wasn't for the fact that she had only minutes before been nothing more than a desiccated and ancient husk of a corpse, the only thing that would have been unusual was that she was entirely naked. Cupping her face in a hand and seeing the piercing blue-green eyes focus in on his face, Kaius ignored her, using his thumb to push her lips apart to reveal a pair of lengthened, pointed fangs in the space of her canine teeth. "She's a vampire." "Well, that makes things easier. Lydia, would you like the honours?" For a moment, Lydia's annoyance at Sophia's mocking tone and the way the smaller woman clicked her fingers and gestured to the vampiress overpowered the huskarl's desire to step forward and slay the creature. While they had journeyed together for almost 2 months, there certainly wasn't any true friendship between them, although this just made Sophia enjoy baiting the humorless woman all the more. "No." From his position, looking at the nude vampire, Kaius shook his head and gestured for Sophia and Lydia to stay where they were. "At least, not yet." "Not yet? Why?" "I have never seen or heard of any magicka like this before, so it might be useful to find out more before we kill her." Rising to his feet, he raised an eyebrow in Sophia's direction and inclined his head to the sarcophagus. "At least we know what the other vampires were looking for, but I'm now really interested in the why." Coughing for a moment at his feet, the vampiress paused, and with a groan, pushed herself up into a kneeling position, looking around at the trio as they stood there, hands on weapons, and watching her every move. "Vamadu?" For a moment she coughed, struggling to force the words out of her chest and her throat almost out of sheer willpower. "Vaya?" Raising an eyebrow, Kaius turned slightly, looking between Sophia and Lydia and gesturing to the still kneeling vampiress. "Well, any ideas?" I don't know." Sophia couldn't help but shrug. "It's Nordic, I think." "It is not the tongue of Whiterun hold." Axe still in hand, Lydia was practically hidden under her armour, but her unease was obvious. "I don't think it's any from any of the old holds either. If I had to guess, I would say it was a dialect of the northwestern holds, maybe Harfingar, or even the Reach, but I've never heard it before." The look of interest on the restored woman's face was unmistakable, as were the glows that infused themselves into her eyes at the mention of Solitude's hold, but the sudden barrage of words were not. After the failed attempts to communicate, she groaned, this time from annoyance rather than residual pain, and went to rise, only for Kaius to put his gloved hand on her shoulder in a gentle but firm warning. Staring each other down with glowing pools of fire in her eyes, the vampiress almost growled, but clearly thought better of it, especially how she was entirely nude and practically surrounded by a trio of heavily armed, and blood-soaked killers. "Wo he?" The words were of a different language to the first, but the looks of confusion and lack of understanding of the trio's expressions was more than enough to make her scowl in annoyance. "Quies?" "Ah, nomen mihi est Kaius, intelligenci verba me?" "Si." This time it was the vampiress who frowned in confusion, staring Kaius in the eye as they spoke ancient Cyrodiilic. "Lingua mirandium intelligioti? Lingua colloviae loqui potensi?" "Yes." While she had been confused before, it only increased while the vampiress stared at Kaius, but repeatedly glanced between the two women, keeping a safe distance from her. "I can speak Colovian, mostly. A bit of Nibonese also. Just who are you people?" Her pronunciation was thick and rough, guttural in ways that made Lydia's Nordic accent appear almost perfect, but it was understandable at least. Some adventurers running a little errand. Sarcasm was practically dripping off his every word, and Kaius's aggression was not lost to the being at his feet. Were you expecting someone different? I was expecting someone from abroad, my family. In the shadows, her eyes were glowing brightly, a golden red glow of burning coals, staring at Kaius without any traces of fear or uncertainty. I don't recognize you. Are you one of my father's little acolytes? A group called the Dawn Guard sent us here, Sophia replied, trying not to shiver as the burning gaze of the vampiress turned to look upon her almost for the first time. The intensity of that stare reminded her all too much of the terrible darkness lurking within Kaius and the other vampires they had fought in the previous months. She still had nightmares about Laylette pinning her to the ground and staring with thirsting eyes as she snapped and salivated for blood, but there was something different with this one. It was almost as though the glow was brighter, stronger, more intense, especially compared to the likes of Morthal's coven. That is not a name I know, and it does not sound like the name a group of vampire would choose. Vampires? Eyes narrowing within the spectacle helm's eye slits, Lydia slowly turned, facing Kaius front on with a creak of metal. Despite being a single word, it rumbled forth from her chest as a growl more dangerous than any saber-cat or vampire. You think I cannot tell my own kind? The burning gaze turned to the heavily armoured Huskal, while her hand gestured to Kaius. I smelled him almost before my organ were open. There could be no doubt to her words or their meaning, and Lydia's gaze hardened even further, in a way that left the air charged with tension. Nobody had a chance to move. Sophia had even started to say something and move as a distraction, but without hesitation, Lydia took 3 powerful steps forward, smashing Kaius off his feet with a single powerful punch. You fucking bastard, she roared, her fist still clenched tightly around the haft of her axe despite the way she had punched him. She continued with another collection of words that left her mouth were directed with all the force of a hurled stone from a trebuchet, but were pure Nordic. Lydia, don't you Lydia me. Her own eyes were burning with a terrible anger that somehow made the vampiress's own seem inconsequential. I knew there was something about you. I knew it from the damned beginning. Shaw's bones, you've been keeping this from me the whole damn time. Attempting to open his mouth in reply, Lydia instead spat another stream of Nordic curses that seemed to convey their meaning, intent, and anatomically horrendous nature with sheer tone alone. Her shield crashed to the floor at his feet, rattling and rolling to a stop, but she was already gone, stomping up the stairs and swearing every step of the way. Sophia, taking a moment to roll his jaw from the hit that was already making his face swell, Kaius winced as there was a metallic crack that was immediately followed by the crash of something large and made of stone being turned to rubble. Can you go make sure that she is all right? Normally decisions like this would be easy for Sophia, especially if she had been drinking, she would simply go with whatever the first thought popped into her head. Instead, she hesitated, looking between Kaius and the vampiress who had scrabbled out of the way of Lydia's march, and up into the shadows, in the direction where the Huskal had gone. Stay with a pair of vampires, or go and calm down an extremely pissed-off Nordic shield maiden. Neither of those prospects boded well for her health, but another sound of shattering stone echoed through the cavern, and she decided that following the sounds of destruction was probably a safer option. So, she nodded once to Kaius, spared a moment to glare at the vampiress, before turning and following in Lydia's footsteps. Chapter 4. Serana. As the sound of leather boots on stonework faded, and Sophia vanished into the shadows beyond the top of the stairs with an uncharacteristic urgency, the sounds of stonework being destroyed and the metal striking stone as Lydia took her frustrations out on anything that came within range. Soon all that was left behind was Kaius and the naked vampiress behind at the bottom of the stairs and the open sarcophagus. So, you have me curious, Kaius said, as the sounds of Lydia and Sophia faded into the crypts that they had journeyed through to reach the cavern. And that curiosity is the only thing between you being sent to meet Molag Bal in person. Who are you? Why were you locked away like this? And why shouldn't I just cut your throat right here and now? A flash of what was unmistakably fear crossed her eyes for a heartbeat, not at the threat of imminent death, but at the mention of the Daedric prince responsible for the vampiric curse. Slowly, grimacing with the effort, she forced her darker side deeper within her being, her fangs sliding up into her gums and becoming human canines once more. And the glows in her eyes, dying like someone kicked sand over a campfire. In its place was just the woman, looking at Kaius with a pair of blue-green eyes and practically glaring at him in challenge. "My name is Serana," she said, carefully thinking out the words and speaking with an accent that showed common was not her native tongue. "As for why I was locked away, that's complicated. Complicated as my housecarl not knowing I was a vampire for the months we've been journeying together, and finding out when another one comes out and says it." Despite the smile on his face, there was not a hint of amusement in his tone. Instead, his voice was threatening, and a silent promise of violence at the slightest provocation. "I know from personal experience that we vampires can heal from most injuries, but regeneration like that is something else entirely. A very neat trick. If you were looking for an explanation of how it works, then unfortunately you are out of luck. I wasn't responsible for preparing it." While the burning glows of vampirism had faded from her eyes, a calculating one instead began to grow in them. "You aren't a usual one of our kind either. You smell different. One of a kind, with at least one surviving exception." Kaius watched as Serana slowly and unsteadily rose to her feet as though expecting him to stop her. "You mentioned your father before. I'm assuming that means father or the like. Is that what you were expecting to be recovered by your sire?" "Lord Harkon." For a moment there was pure panic in her eyes as Serana saw the way how Kaius reached up, his hand passing over the dagger strapped to his chest harness to work on the buckles attaching his cloak to his breastplate. "He's a very powerful man, or was at one point. I'm surprised that another vampire who has made it here hasn't heard of him." "I don't usually make a habit of learning the names of most vampires, at least not until after I've killed them." The last buckle came undone, and he pulled his cloak from his back, handing it over to her as a bundle of wool-lined cloth. "There are very, very few who I have encountered in my time who haven't attacked me or tried to kill me as soon as we met. You are now one of them." Nodding her thanks to Kaius, Serana wrapped the cloak around herself and hid her nakedness from view, and she practically disappeared under the thick, heavy cloak. In many ways, she was similar in size and build to Sophia, and came up to Kaius's nose and height, which allowed the cloak to almost entirely cover her. "Maybe I haven't attacked you yet because I have nothing, and you are heavily armed, and obviously not taking any chances with me." Serana's blue-green eyes glanced at the way that Kaius's hand was resting on the hilt of his sword, in a way that only appeared to be in a casual manner. "I don't know much about you, but I can tell that you're not some young blood. Therefore, you and I both know that even naked and unarmed, our kind are not weak or helpless." "True, but that does make me wonder what is going to happen now." "I'm not sure." Shrugging, and his fingers tapping a steady metallic drum beat on the hilt of his sword, Kaius thought for a moment. "Vampires have been stirring up trouble throughout Skyrim lately, and to me, you, this place, and whatever in oblivion the means of your resurrection, is no coincidence. I came here only in the attempt to gain some support in dealing with the rest of our kind, but I do know that the Dawn Guard would want me to kill you. Not fond of vampires, are they? They wouldn't be one of the oldest vampire hunting orders in Tamriel if they were. It's something that they and I have in common." The obvious curiosity and the questions resulting from Serana regarding the Dawn Guard were crushed aside for the moment. Her attention was easily drawn elsewhere, and Serana looked around the interior of her burial cavern, seeing the bloodstains, ruptured bodies, and the obvious traces of the 4 slain vampires. The blackened, tumbled bones, and the scattered ashes and dust from their combustive demises was something she lingered on. Look, kill me, you'll have just killed another vampire. But if others are after me, there's something bigger going on. That important, are you? Both of them stared into each other's eyes, and Serana could see that Kaius was as cold as the cavern they were standing in. He may have given her his cloak, but there was something about his manner that suggested that he could easily draw his sword, run her through, and walk off without a moment's hesitation. I would also like to find out what sort of magic that was. Moving from her to the interior of the sarcophagus, Kaius trailed off in mid-sentence, his face shifting from grim determination to outright astonishment as his eyes fell upon the object that he and Sophia had attempted to retrieve. It was sitting there, locked into a recess only slightly larger than itself, just over 30 centimeters long, and on instinct, as he went to move towards it, and Serana snarled. Fangs once again bared, nose and brow squashing and reforming as her vampirism rose to the surface. She stepped between him and the open sarcophagus, blocking the view of the object, and utterly heedless to the way that his grip tightened around the hilt of his sword. Is that? Yes, it is, she said, in a voice barely human. And it's mine. For a handful of seconds they stood there, unmoving, and while Serana's face was twisted and partially inhuman, Kaius was stunned in place, mouth fallen open in amazement, and struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Thankfully for the both of them, the sound of footsteps broke their standoff, as Sophia practically skipped her way down the stairs. Lydia will need a few more minutes, but I managed to calm her down a little. Stopping in place, Sophia glanced between the two of them, seeing the way that Serana's vampirism had surfaced with some measure of concern, while also noting how she was dressed in Kaius's cloak. Is everything okay here? Yeah, visibly shaking himself. Kaius turned away from Serana and the sarcophagus and looked at Sophia. How is she? She's royally pissed off. She hates me, he said softly, almost too softly for anyone to hear. She hates you because you didn't trust her enough to tell her yourself. I'd hate to say, I told you so. Crossing her arms, Sophia kept Serana in the corner of her eye, but frowned at Kaius. Actually, who am I kidding? I'm going to love saying it. I told you so. There, that's something else you owe me for. I know. Then you should have done something about it. It wouldn't have mattered if you were Pelagius the Mad or Manimarco himself. She has sworn an oath to you, and will follow you no matter what you are or what you do. And what about you? It's been months, Kaius. If I was going to leave, I would have left after Bleak Falls Barrow. Or the dragon. Or the throat of the world. Or... I get your point, Sophia. Good. Don't worry about me. I'll be by your side, until I find someone better to stalk. Despite the grin on her face, there was a deadly seriousness in her tone as she threw a thumb in the direction of Serana. What about it? They both saw the way that Serana scowled a little at Sophia's words, turning away from the sarcophagus and tucking the object into the folds of her cloak. I am undecided at the moment. What do you think we should do? Cut her throat, find everything shiny in here, and go spend it at the nearest tavern. The deep was not lost on either of them, and Serana moved closer, ignoring the way that Sophia edged away. Her vampirism was once again hidden, but there was no mistaking the way she moved like one. Unlike Kaius, she was obviously not used to keeping her nature hidden. My family used to live on an island in western Harbinger. I would guess they still do, Serana said simply, ignoring the way that Sophia was watching her like a hawk and not making any attempts at hiding the way she was gripping the hilt of her short sword. If anyone is going to know what is going on, it would be my family. Don't tell me you're actually considering that. Rounding on her companion, Sophia rolled her eyes at Kaius with an exasperated sigh. Solitude is what? At least a week's travel from here? More, if we can't get on a barge through Hjalmarch's marshes? Yeah. And she's a vampire, which means travelling by night. A vampire with an Elder Scroll. Sophia and Serana both stopped and stared. Sophia with an expression of shock mirroring Kaius's only minutes before, and Serana staring with a new level of concern. An Elder Scroll. She has an Elder Scroll, as in a solidified piece of time, a key to the past, present, future, and all sorts of reality-breaking nonsense. That kind of Elder Scroll. Yeah. How the fuck does she have an Elder Scroll? Turning and staring with his expression once again grim and foreboding, Kaius stared, while Serana simply stood still, her body and the priceless golden artifact hidden underneath her borrowed cloak. I have no idea. All the Elder Scrolls scattered themselves during the Great War, and I haven't heard of any being found since. That, all by itself, I think is worth us helping her just to find out how such a thing happened. Cold expressions, hooded gazes, and suspicion was shared between the three of them as they stood, waiting for one of the others to make the first move. Finally, Sophia sighed loudly, groaning with half-feigned annoyance and folding her arms. Well then, I suppose we better find our way out of here. In the time it took for Lydia to return, her frustrations resolved on various inanimate objects, Serana had busied herself with stripping various idle articles of clothing from the handful of thralls. Most of the clothes were various sizes too large, but with little other choices available, she soon managed to conceal her nudity under more than just Kaius's cloak, acquiring pants, tunic, and most importantly shoes for their return to the surface. What she did lack, however, was a weapon, but the brief attempt to acquire a sword from one of the fallen was quickly stopped with a warning from Kaius before they made their way back to the surface. Dim Hollow Crypt, like many of its kind throughout Skyrim, was an ancient barrow, long since disused and abandoned centuries before, but the dead never rested easily in such places. Draugr, mummified and ancient, habitually rose from their slumber, and even after clearing the crypt on their way to Serana's burial cavern, some had already begun to awaken from the intrusion. Compared to the likes of thralls and vampires, they were easily dealt with, especially as Serana proved to be exceptionally dangerous even while clad in cloth and fabric, unarmed, and not even using her vampiric abilities. Okay, that was impressive. Looking down to the Draugr at her feet, and the long chunk of ice that had been conjured and thrown through its skull from several meters away, Sophia looked between Serana and Kaius, rubbing her temple at the mild headache. You know how to use some magic, that's for sure. Kaius moved silently through the main entrance hall of the crypt, seeing the half-dozen mummified beings scattered about from their brief skirmish, and assuring none would rise yet again. Nearby, Lydia was busy pulling her axe free from the chest cavity of one of the more heavily armoured of the undead, the ancient, rusting armour proving little hindrance to her heirloom weapon. Lydia, you okay? There was no answer, and Lydia didn't even look in his direction, or make any indication that Kaius was even present. Instead, wiping her axe clean and glaring around for something else to slay. Knowing better than to push the huskal in any manner at the moment, Kaius looked around the interior of the crypt's main entrance and sighed. It was still daylight outside, and travelling was going to be complicated, but potentially not as complicated as attempting to remain in a crypt with an increasing active population of undead until nightfall. Between the weeks the thralls and vampires had been excavated and exploring the enormous underground crypt complex, and the recent fighting that day, the Draugr were now well and truly active. Okay, we need to secure this room. Sophia, see if you can find a way to close off the main doors. I'll move the bodies before you do, though. Why? Serana was softly spoken, and while there was a level of confidence, she obviously didn't like raising her voice any more than she needed to. Aren't we going to start travelling? Not until sundown, then we should be able to... Trailing off, Kaius stopped in mid-motion and mid-sentence once more, turning to look at Serana while he spoke to her. Sophia and Lydia too had stopped what they were doing and stared in equal parts confusion and unease. What's wrong with leaving now? Serana said expectantly, looking at their expressions of astonishment as she stood just outside the crypt's entrance, in full sunlight and without the slightest ill effect. Chapter 5. Truth in the Shadows. Dim Hollow Crypt, just like the dozens of resting places of the ancient dead of the dragon cult, was remote, a considerable distance from any settlements, and they were forced to encamp once night fell. All their expectations of having to travel by night had been proven false by Serana's simple act of walking out of the crypt, but out of all of them, it was definitely Kaius who was struggling with the revelation. Sophia had long since grown used to his seemingly unique ability to withstand the light of the sun, and Lydia had immediately accepted it after months of travelling together. But it was obvious that Kaius had never really considered the fact that there could be others sharing his curse who could exist in the sunlight. Like he had dozens of times before, Kaius had managed to light a small campfire, while Sophia pitched the two travellers' tents and Lydia gathered the wood needed to keep the flames going for the evening. While winter was a recent memory, frosts were still overwhelmingly common, and it allowed them to supplement their rations with the snow hares Kaius had managed to catch. "It's at least 3 or 4 days to Mothall," he said simply, as he expertly skinned and gutted the last of the hares. "We'll stock up on supplies there and head to Dragonbridge. All in all, it should be a week, maybe a week and a half to get into Harbingers." In their travels, Sophia had become to enjoy watching the way Kaius went about preparing any game that was caught. Rabbits, deer, wild boar, or otherwise, he had a skill and a knack with a knife that he had never seen before, and she watched as he slit the hares open, scooped their insides out, and filled them with a collection of river stones for cooking. There was something disturbingly memorizing about the way he went about it with such precision and ease from many, many years of practice. He was so skilled in the motions that he could twirl the knife and cut the rabbits apart without even looking at what he was doing. One time, she had watched him perform the same process with a deer. "How certain that your family is still in the region?" Nearly every moment since the crypt, Lydia had been staring daggers at Serana and Kaius, and as they sat around the campfire, the helmetless glare was intensifying. It wasn't being helped with the strange dynamic in the campsite, with Lydia and Sophia sitting close, and Kaius and Serana sitting equal distances away from the pair, and each other at the same time. "I don't." Hidden under her required clothes and Caius's cloak, hugging her knees and with only a portion of her face visible under the hood, Serana seemed tiny, almost swallowed up in the fabric. "I don't even know whether they still exist." "Just how old are you?" Seated next to Lydia and watching the vampiress's eyes reflecting the campfire, Sophia thought back to the way how Kaius had roughly told her his age the night they encountered Sanguin. Initially, all she got back was a shrug in return, as Serana looked at her with glowing eyes. "I don't know." "How old are you, then?" If Lydia could be any more insubordinate of her tone and mannerisms, she would have done so, throwing the barbed question at Caius, causing Sophia to wince from the tone. There was no more "yes, my Thane, no, my Thane, 3 sacks full, my Thane" from her any more. 235, Caius said simply, tossing a handful of entrails into the hole dug into the soil at his side. "Give or take a year." Only the crackling of the campfire could be heard as they all digested the information, and Sophia pulled her cloak tighter around herself for more than just the spring chill. Such a number somehow made her feel lonely, which was an unusual feeling. "How long were you in that place?" she asked instead, trying and failing to look the other vampire in the eye. "Good question." For several moments, Serana sat deep in thought, taking one of the freshly roasted snow hares from Caius as he pulled the first from the coals. I can't really tell." Sophia handed Lydia her roasted hare, skewered on one of the thin steel roasting sticks that Caius kept strapped to his travelling bag for just this purpose, and bit into her own. Lydia wasn't even accepting food from Caius at the moment, and would only look at him or acknowledge him with a glare or a voice filled with barely contained frustration. Serana, though, was something different, and had both the other women on edge, especially as they watched the vampiress chewing thoughtfully on her hunk of roasted snow hare. When Kaius had come back into camp after his companions had a very uneasy hour alone with Serana, one of the rabbits he had brought back was still alive and twitching in his hand. Somehow he had managed to catch it alive and unharmed, and without any word of explanation or warning, he had simply handed it to Serana, who promptly bit its head off. Sophia couldn't decide what was more horrifying, the way the vampiress had changed into a darker nature and unhinged her jaw slightly, the way she had simply chewed a few times before swallowing, or the fact that she had fastened her mouth around the stump and drained the corpse of blood before handing it back to Kaius. The more she thought of it, the worst part was the way Serana had looked horrified at what she had done for the briefest of moments, before returning to her seemingly usual cold persona. She had seen the vampire within Serana in the crypt and knew that just below the surface was a monster, just like the others they had recently fought in Morthal in the crypt. Sophia also knew Kaius well enough that his casual appearance was a charade, and that he was studying their new travelling companion very, very intently. The rabbit, like everything else that day, had been a test of her abilities and what she was, especially since the revelation that she could resist sunlight. I feel like it was a long time, somehow, Serana said delicately, picking the leg clean with her human, unchanged teeth. Who's Skyrim's Hogkunnen? High King? Every so often, though through the accent Serana would slip back into was undeniably her native tongue, that both Sophia and Lydia struggled to translate. It was Nordic, or at least related to the various dialects of Skyrim's holds, but was different somehow, cruder, more rough or polished in comparison. That's actually a matter for debate. Oh, wonderful, another war of succession. Ignoring the way that Kaius had been snorting in amusement at Sophia's tone, Serana flicked a tiny leg bone into the fire. Good to know the world didn't get boring while I was gone. Who are the contenders this time? The Empire supports Elsif the Fair, Kaius said, pulling one of the last of the snow hares out of the fire by spearing it with the point of his sword. But there are many in Skyrim loyal to Ulfric Stormcloak. The look of confusion was impossible to ignore as Serana turned and frowned at Kaius. Empire? What empire? The Empire. Pulling the impaled rabbit away from his mouth and swallowing a mouthful of hot flesh, he gestured about himself. The Mead Empire. From Cyrodiil. Cyrodiil? Where's Cyrodiil? Realization crossed Serana's face and her mouth fell open in surprise. You mean Cyrod? Cyrod is the seat of an empire? I must have been gone longer than I thought. Definitely longer than we planned. I need to get home so we can figure out what happened. For the first time in hours, Lydia, Sophia, and Kaius all shared expressions of confusion and unease as Serana tucked her legs up under her chin even tighter with both arms. Tell me about your home. His words were soft, but there was a tenseness running through Kaius now, one that outmatched his earlier unease around Serana. It's on an island several days west of Solitude. Huddled under the cloak and over-large clothing, the vampiress seemed somewhat small despite her obvious nature. It's my family home. Not the most welcoming place, but depending on who's around, I'll be safe there. Why wouldn't you be safe there? Leaning forward, Sophia spat a chunk of gristle into the flames that sizzled and spat. We all saw what you did to those Draugr back in the crypt, and beside that, you're a vampire to boot. Let's just say that my mother and father had a bit of a falling out. She caught Kaius's expression and gave what Sophia guessed was a reassuring smile. Not that she needed reassurance, but at least there weren't any hints of fangs in that grin. Don't worry, I'm not in any danger or anything like that. It'll just be more unpleasant to run into my father. He sounds like quite the guy. There was absolutely no mistaking the threat in Lydia's voice as she finished her meal and dragged her axe over her lap. There was also no mistaking the intent as she went about the process of scraping the edge clean and sharp again with a whetstone, all the while watching Serana. So, who was High King before you... well, you know, Sophia asked, partially because she was curious in a morbid kind of way. Well, King Olaf had passed away a year or two before, and I never really found out who was named as his successor. He went to all the trouble of capturing a dragon to end the war. It looks like wars of succession are to be the norm. Again, Lydia and Sophia shared a glance, and their unease was mirrored by Kaius as he stopped in place, showing the most amount of emotion that either of them had ever seen. Half-chewed food fell out of his mouth, and he openly gaped at Serana. King Olaf, as in Olaf One-Eye? He was High King? I know my accent is hard to understand, but you all seem to know of him. Serana's expression was quizzical and confused, looking over their expressions of astonishment. How long ago was his reign? Serana. Kaiser's sword had somehow turned from an eating implement into a deadly weapon once again, his grip tightening as he stared at her. In what year were you born? 549. Why, what's the problem? She saw the way that all three were watching, and the circular motion Sophia was making with her hand, with an expression of, and go on her face. 549 of... The year 549 since Ysgramor's conquests. Again, what is the problem? Silence fell between them again, and Sophia's face scrunched in concentration as she tried to remember the dates in history, and the answer that entered her mind made her want a bottle of mead. Or a dozen. Serana, that was in the Meriethic era. Am I supposed to understand the reference? In the months travelling with him, there had been very few times when Sophia could remember Kaius looking surprised, and only a few where he had been nervous. Against the dragon, murdering dozens of people and destroying a fort around them had been one of those times, but sitting in front of a fire and listening to a vampiric woman was not one that Sophia expected to see him equally nervous and uneasy. Well, so much has been lost to time and history that most dates are uncertain to confirm with any real accuracy. Barata! A hint of fangs glinted in the night, and Serana snapped at him. Just tell me. You were born about 4,500 years ago, and if my memory of history is correct, you have been in that crypt for the past 4,000 years. If they had thought Serana had been shocked before, they had been mistaken. Her mouth fell open, fangs growing slightly, eyes widening, and a nose flattening as though she was becoming a bat. For several moments it was almost as though her darker nature would fully rise to the surface, before she crushed it aside with her will, showing a moment of sadness before rising to her feet. I need a moment, she said softly, turning and walking a short distance away to sit at the base of a tree, with a cloak hanging limply from her shoulders. Fucking oblivion, Kaius muttered to himself, staring at Serana as she wrapped herself up into her borrowed cloak. She didn't seem to take that well, Sophia added, staring in Serana's direction as well. Would you? We just told her everything that she knew about this world. Hells, we just told her that her entire world ceased to exist a long time ago. There's a goddamn good chance that she's completely alone. So? The sound of the whetstone on the axe punctuated Lydia's every word. She's a vampire. Being alone is the least she deserves. It's still worth travelling to her home. Kaius chose to ignore the obvious connotations of his Huskarl's comments and actions with her axe had. It'll most likely be a ruin if it exists at all, but at least now we have a better idea of why the other vampires want her. Besides the Elder Scroll? Sophia found her attention drawn to the burning embers of the fire, somehow feeling a little of the weight of eons that had come crashing down onto Serana. Yeah, the older a vampire, the more powerful they are. You both remember just how strong Morvarth was. He was maybe 700 years old. If Serana is telling us the truth, then she is quite easily the oldest vampire in existence, and over 4 times as old. That is something to be extremely concerned about. Then why don't we just kill her? Because she might not be the only one of her kind. All three of them stared off into the shadows at the tiny cloaked figure huddled against a tree a short distance away. That is not a possibility we can afford to ignore. For the following 2 weeks, they travelled north through northwest Skyrim, staying for brief periods in towns and villages along the way, and all the while taking care to keep Serana's true nature hidden from those they encountered. In a lot of ways, this was easier than they all expected, as while she was capable of travelling and withstanding the sun, Serana was no means utterly immune to it. It weakened her, sapping her strength and endurance to the point where they were forced to seek transportation via wagon and ox cart to continue their journey to the extreme northern reaches of Skyrim. Here, where the Druidark Mountains reached the Sea of Ghosts, they finally arrived, looking across a narrow strait to an island with a towering edifice built upon it. A castle, ancient and worn by wind and waves, loomed against the clear blue expanse of the open waters, as though it was treating the Sea of Ghosts as little more than a moat. It was tall, powerful, and larger than any legion fought throughout Tamriel, with Kaius estimating it was 200 or 300 meters wide, and still remarkably intact. There was no doubting its age, and despite the threat of what could be awaiting them within its shadowed, seemingly abandoned interior, Kaius chose to travel at low tide, with only Serana by his side. Neither Lydia or Sophia minded being left behind. Sophia didn't like the idea of crossing the thin strip of ocean-smoothed stones that was revealed when the waters receded in the morning, and Lydia was still not on speaking terms with Kaius, and almost seemed to be going out of her way to ignore him. A campsite was arranged, a fire lit in a shallow depression in the rolling, rocky coastline to protect themselves from the frigid wind blowing from the north, but neither of them had a chance to get settled before Kaius returned. The sun was far above their heads, and in the clear blue sky there wasn't a single cloud to be seen as Kaius made his way carefully over the strip of land, now being swallowed up by the sea. The tides were returning, and soon there wouldn't be any means to cross at all. But it wasn't the encroaching water that seemed to make him move with a distinct haste. That was quick. What happened to Serana? For a moment, it seemed as though Kaius hadn't heard Sophia's question, his expression grave, and repeatedly looking back over his shoulder at the shadowed fortress. Kaius? What in oblivion happened? I met Serana's father. I guess your worries about there being another vampire ancient around was accurate. Let's go kick his ass. The way that he shook his head was foreboding, as was the true expression of concern on his face. So I'm guessing that wasn't the bad news. Standing a short distance away, Lydia watched them both, and even through her disdain and frustrations, she too could feel the way that Kaius was on edge. It was also the first time that either of them had seen him truly concerned. That doesn't even come close to the bad news, he said, turning and staring off at the castle, feeling the sea breeze on his face and the taste of salt in the air as the tide continued rolling in. Serana is his daughter, not figuratively, but literally. They are the first. The first what? Despite herself, Lydia couldn't help but ask the question as her curiosity got the better of her. The first of their kind. They are Volokar. Both Sophia and Lydia couldn't help but react to that name. The Volokar were true legends, older than the kingdom of Skyrim itself, and all three Cyrodiilic empires. They were nightmares given form, tales told to children, and whispered warnings passed down through the countless generations. And you left Serana there, with the Elder Scroll. I didn't have any choice in the matter. There were too many of them, even for me, let alone against the likes of a child of Cold Harbour. A child of what now? A vampire pureblood, the first of their kind, a founder of a vampiric strain and dynasty, personally granted the curse by Molag Bal himself. Tearing his gaze from the ancient castle, Kaius looked between Sophia and Lydia, and they could see the way he was deeply troubled from whatever had occurred in the castle. We, and Skyrim, are in really deep shit.